They laughed the moment he walked toward her. A room full of people, ranchers, merchants, mothers clutching their daughters' arms, and every single one of them thought it was a joke. The biggest, most feared man in the territory had just passed over every pretty face in Red Hollow and stopped in front of her. Abigail Boone. The one they called too large, too plain, too much of everything that didn't matter and not enough of anything that did. Her own father grabbed her arm to pull her back. Caleb Ryder didn't move an inch. This is the story of the woman they all got wrong, and the winter that proved it. If this story speaks to you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now sit back, because this one's going to take a while, and it's worth every minute. The auction barn smelled like wet hay, wood smoke, and cattle that hadn't been moved since morning. It was the kind of cold that didn't announce itself politely. It pushed through the gaps in the wooden walls, crawled under coat collars, and settled into the joints of anyone who'd been standing too long. Outside, Red Hollow was already bracing for what the older ranchers called a killing winter, the kind that buried fences to the post caps and turned dirt roads into rivers of frozen mud that could swallow a horse up to its knee. But inside the Gartner livestock barn that Saturday afternoon, the cold wasn't what people were talking about. They were talking about Caleb Ryder. He had arrived just after noon in a black wagon pulled by two horses the size of barn doors, animals so well fed and heavily muscled that men stopped their conversations just to watch them pass. Caleb himself climbed down from the wagon seat without much ceremony, stamped the mud off his boots, and walked into the auction barn like a man who already knew exactly what he was there for and wasn't particularly interested in the opinions of anyone who didn't. He was enormous. Not in the soft, settled way of men who'd made money and stopped working, but in the carved, deliberate way of a man who still split his own wood, still pulled fence wire with his bare hands, and still slept 4 hours a night because the ranch demanded the rest. His coat was plain wool, dark brown, fraying at the left cuff. His hat had been resoled at least twice. His face was the kind of face that didn't tell you much until it did. Angular, weathered, with dark eyes that moved through a room the way a hawk moves through open sky. Steady, missing nothing. He was 34 years old and had not taken a wife. That fact alone had made him the most discussed man in 3 counties. Word had spread through Red Hollow the way word always spread in small towns, fast, wrong in the details, and impossible to stop. Someone had heard from someone that Caleb Ryder was coming down from the mountain to find a wife. Not court one. Not write letters to one. Find one. Practical as buying a horse, some said. Efficient as a man who had no time for nonsense, said others. By the time Saturday came, every unmarried woman in the territory between the ages of 17 and 32 had found a reason to attend the livestock auction. They had done their hair. They had pressed their good dresses. 3 of them had borrowed jewelry from their mothers that they hadn't been given permission to borrow. And they were not wrong to come prepared. The moment Caleb walked through the barn doors, a very specific kind of stillness fell over the room. The kind that happens when something large and unpredictable enters an enclosed space and everyone instinctively reassesses their position. Greta Holloway smoothed her skirt. Ida Pierce pinched color into her cheeks with 2 fingers. The Marsh sisters, Ellen and Clara, shifted closer to the open floor where they could be seen more easily. And over in the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of grain crates and a water barrel, Abigail Boone was trying to help her father count cattle invoices and pretending very hard that none of it had anything to do with her. She was 26 years old, and she was not what Red Hollow considered pretty. This was something she had been informed of consistently and without particular kindness since she was old enough to understand what the word pretty meant and what it was supposed to require. She was tall, almost as tall as most of the men in town, and broad-shouldered in the way that made women her age hold themselves smaller so as not to seem too much. Her hands were rough from ranch work. Her hair was the color of dark wheat, thick and difficult to manage, usually pinned up in a way that her mother used to help her with before her mother passed, and now managed alone in a small tin mirror with whatever pins she could find. Her face, if you looked at it without the lens of what Red Hollow thought it should be, was striking in its own way. Strong jaw, clear gray eyes, with a slight heaviness at the outer corners that made her look thoughtful even when she wasn't thinking anything in particular. A wide mouth that smiled slowly and then fully when it did. But Red Hollow didn't look at her that way. Red Hollow looked at her and saw a big woman in a faded dress who'd never had a proper suitor and probably never would, and most people had filed that fact away and moved on with their lives. Abigail had, mostly. She got up in the mornings, she fed the animals, she helped her father with the ranch accounts because he was better with cattle than numbers, and someone had to balance the books. She cooked and she cleaned and she fixed what broke, and she did not, as a general rule, let herself think too hard about the things she was probably never going to have. She was practical. It was the only armor that had never failed her. "Hold this," her father said, pressing a stack of folded papers into her hands without looking up from the auction sheet. Thomas Boone was a lean, restless man of 51 who had once been handsome and now was mostly just tired. He had the habit of treating Abigail less like a daughter and more like a very reliable ranch hand he hadn't had to hire. "Don't let them get out of order. The Pruitt invoice needs to be on top." "It's already on top," Abigail said. "Don't give me lip." "I'm not giving you lip. I'm telling you where the invoice is." Her father made a sound somewhere between acknowledgement and dismissal and went back to squinting at the auction list. Abigail shifted the papers in her hands and looked up. And that was when she saw Caleb Ryder walking through the barn. She noticed him the way you noticed a storm moving in off the mountains. Not with excitement, necessarily, but with a kind of instinctive alertness that said, "That is a thing worth watching." He was moving through the crowd slowly, not pushing, not hurrying. People stepped aside for him without quite realizing they were doing it. He nodded at a few men he apparently recognized. He didn't smile much. He didn't look at the women who were watching him. Well, Abigail thought, and turned back to her father's invoices. The auction started at 2 in the afternoon and moved through cattle, horses, and winter grain at the grinding pace these things always did, with too much deliberation over prices that everyone already knew, and too many side conversations that had nothing to do with the livestock being sold. Caleb stood near the back for the first hour. He bought a small group of well-bred steers at a price that made a few other ranchers grimace and then pretend they hadn't, which meant the price was high and he hadn't flinched, which meant he was comfortable, which ran directly counter to the rumors that his mountain ranch was failing. People noticed. People whispered. Abigail was refilling the water pitcher near the back table when she heard Greta Holloway say, just loudly enough, "He's even bigger up close. Did you notice his hands?" "I noticed everything," said Ida Pierce. "He hasn't looked at anyone yet." "He will." "He'd better hurry. My mother says a man that age who hasn't married is either hiding something or has nothing to offer." "He doesn't look like a man with nothing to offer." Abigail set the pitcher down and went back to her corner. An hour later, the livestock portion of the auction wound down, and the barn shifted into the looser, louder social gathering it always became by late afternoon. Men talking prices, women talking about the men talking prices, children running between legs until someone's mother caught them. Caleb moved through the room. It was Ida Pierce who made the first real approach, a direct, unhurried walk toward him, with her chin up and her best smile forward. Abigail watched it happen because she happened to be watching the door, thinking about whether the clouds gathering in the north meant snow before nightfall. She watched Ida say something. She watched Caleb respond, politely, she thought, from the way his posture stayed neutral. And then she watched Ida's smile flicker just slightly before it reset itself to something more determined. Then Greta. Then Ellen Marsh. Then Clara Marsh, who nudged Ellen out of the way in a maneuver that was not as subtle as Clara seemed to believe. Caleb talked to each of them the same way he had talked to the cattle sellers. Attentive, not unkind, not particularly moved. Abigail's father appeared at her elbow. "I need you to take the Pruitt papers to Harlan Pruitt before he leaves. He's over by the east doors." "I can see that." She took the papers. "I'll go now." She cut across the barn floor, keeping close to the edges, the way she always moved through crowded rooms, efficiently, without drawing attention, taking up as little space as the path allowed. She was 3 steps from the east doors when someone stepped into her path. She nearly collided with him before she looked up. Caleb Ryder was standing directly in front of her. He was taller than she'd realized. She was not a small woman, and she was looking up at him, which didn't happen often. He had the Pruitt papers in her hand pressed between them for an awkward half-second before she stepped back and pulled them to her chest. "Sorry," she said automatically. "I wasn't watching." "No," he said. "I moved into your way on purpose." She looked at him. He was looking at her with that same steady, hawk in open sky attention he'd moved through the whole room with, except now it was directed entirely at her, which was a different thing altogether. She felt it like a hand pressing flat against her sternum. Not painful, but impossible to ignore. "Caleb Ryder," he said. "I know who you are," she said. "Abigail Boone. I know who you are too." She didn't know what to do with that, so she didn't do anything with it. "I need to get these papers to Harlan Pruitt before he leaves." "Pruitt's already left," Caleb said. "Saw him go 10 minutes ago." She turned and looked at the east doors. Empty. "Wonderful," she said, mostly to herself. "I'll get it to him Monday," Caleb said. "If you'd like. I pass his property on the way down from my ridge." She turned back. "Why would you do that?" "Because I wanted a reason to keep talking to you for another minute, and that seemed like an honest one." The noise of the barn kept moving around them. Somewhere behind her she could hear Ida Pierce laughing at something, a high, bright sound designed to carry across a room. She could feel people looking. Not many yet, but a few. The way people start looking when something unusual is happening and they can't quite tell what it is yet. "Mr. Ryder," she said carefully, "I don't know what you think you're doing, but I'm asking you a question," he said. "Or I'm about to, if you'll let me." She waited. "Are you spoken for?" The room might as well have dropped 10 degrees. She felt the heat come up her neck before she could stop it. Not from pleasure, but from the old familiar burn of humiliation starting its approach, because surely this was a joke. Surely in another second he was going to say, "Just kidding," or look over at someone and laugh, because that was how it went. That was always how it went. "No," she said, because she was not a liar. "I'm not spoken for." "Good," Caleb said. And then quietly, "I'm not looking for someone who's going to make me feel rich or important. I'm looking for someone who knows how to work and how to think and how to hold a hard thing without dropping it. I've been watching you in this barn for 2 hours. You're the one." The silence that followed was a very particular kind of silence. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. And then the laughter started. It came from everywhere at once, the way laughter does when a whole room has been holding its breath around the same unspoken joke, and someone finally sets it loose. Not all of it was cruel. Some of it was just shock, the breathless kind, the "did he really just" kind. But some of it was the other kind, the pointed kind, the kind that goes looking for a specific target and makes sure it knows it's been found. "Did he just... Abigail Boone? Abigail Boone? Lord, the man's been up in the mountains too long." Her father appeared from somewhere to her left, moving fast, face red. "Abby!" He took her arm. "Abby, come away." "Let go," she said. "You're embarrassing yourself." "I haven't done anything." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Let go of my arm." Caleb had not moved. He was watching her father's hand on her arm with an expression that hadn't changed much, but something behind his eyes had gone very still, the way water goes still right before it turns to ice. Thomas Boone looked at Caleb with the specific expression of a man trying to calculate whether he was dealing with someone dangerous or merely eccentric. "I don't know what you think you're doing, Ryder, but my daughter isn't—" "I'm asking your daughter a question," Caleb said. "Not you. She's not... she isn't suitable for... I didn't ask your opinion on what she is." Not loud, not aggressive. Just a wall. The laughter in the room was still going, but quieter now. People were watching. Greta Holloway had her hand over her mouth. The Marsh sisters were whispering to each other with their eyes very wide. Abigail's father dropped her arm. She looked at Caleb. There were 1,000 reasonable things to do in that moment. She knew this. She could have laughed it off and walked away. She could have said thank you kindly and no thank you and been done with it. She was a practical woman. She did not do things that didn't make sense, but she looked at Caleb Ryder's face, at the complete stubborn absence of mockery in it, and something she had spent years bearing very carefully shifted in her chest. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he said. "That's what I'm proposing to fix." The barn had gone almost fully quiet now. Someone's child dropped something metal, and the clang rang off the wooden walls like a bell. "I'd need to think about it," she said. "Fair," he said. "And I have questions." "I'd be worried if you didn't." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she looked at the room, at her father's red face, at the open amusement of people who had been underestimating her for as long as she could remember, At Ida Pierce's stunned expression that had finally, for the first time in 26 years, stopped being directed at Abigail like a weapon and started looking like something else entirely. "I'll give you an hour," she said. They talked on the bench outside the barn, while the cold settled in and the clouds she'd been watching all afternoon finally began to make good on their promise. The first few snowflakes came down lazy and wide, the kind that settle on your sleeve and stay long enough for you to look at them properly before they're gone. She had expected him to try to sell her something, the ranch, himself, a future that sounded better than it would turn out to be. Men did that. She had seen enough of it in her father to recognize the shape of it. Caleb didn't sell her anything. He told her about the mountain ranch the way you tell someone about a place you love and are also afraid of. Honestly, with the ugly parts included. He told her the elevation made winters brutal. He told her the isolation was real and not romantic. He told her the Hands were good men mostly, but they had doubts about him, and he'd earned some of them. He told her the previous year's drought had cost him 200 head and set him back further than he wanted to admit. "So why a wife now?" she asked. "If things are that difficult." He was quiet for a moment. "Because difficult is easier with someone beside you than alone. And I've been alone long enough to know the difference." "That's not a very romantic reason." "No," he agreed. "Is romance what you're looking for?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know what I'm looking for. I stopped planning on looking for anything a while ago." "Why?" She gave him a look. He met her eyes. "Right," he said, and didn't push. She appreciated that more than she expected to. The snow was coming harder now, small and needle-fine, the serious kind that meant business. People were beginning to leave the barn behind them in ones and twos, pulling coats tight and calling to children. "I'll need my own corner of things," she said. "I'm not going to be a decoration or a warm body to put food on a table. I'll work, but I decide how." "That's fine. And if you ever treat me like I'm less than—" "I won't. You don't know that. You don't know me." "No, but I know the kind of man I'm trying to be, and that kind of man doesn't do that." She looked at him. He looked back. "I'll come," she said. Not warmly, not with a smile, just as a fact stated plainly, the way she stated most facts. "I'll come, and I'll give it a fair trial, and if it isn't working, we say so." He nodded. "When?" "Tonight, before I lose my nerve." Something moved through his face, too quick to name, but real. "I'll get the wagon ready." Her father found her in the house 20 minutes later, folding her 2 good dresses into a traveling bag with the focused efficiency of someone who has already made up their mind and is not particularly interested in the conversation about to happen. "You cannot be serious," he said from the doorway. "I'm always serious, you know that." "Abigail." He came into the room. "Abigail, look at me." She did. He had the look he always had when things weren't going the way he'd planned. A cornered look, frustrated and reaching for something, trying on arguments like coats until he found one that fit. "That man is taking you up into the mountains in a snowstorm. You don't know him. You don't know anything about his life up there." "I know more than you'd think," she said. "I asked." "He's going to make a fool of you." She put the second dress in the bag and smoothed it flat. "He's had an hour to do that, and he didn't. That's more than most people have managed in 26 years. Her father sat down heavily on the edge of her bed. The fight went out of him the way it always did, suddenly, leaving him just tired. "Your mother would have something to say about this." Mama would have made him sit down and fed him something and then asked him about his water table and his winter stores, Abigail said, "which is what I did, more or less." He was quiet. "All right," she said. "When I get settled. If anything happens to you up there." "Something's happening to me right here," she said. Not cruelly, just honestly. "I'd rather it happened somewhere that might go differently." She buckled the bag closed. The wagon moved out of Red Hollow in the early dark, snow falling in earnest now, the town's scattered lights shrinking behind them as the road tilted upward into the mountains. She could hear them, even over the wind, the last sounds of Red Hollow following her out. A man's laugh, recognizable even at a distance. A woman's voice saying something she couldn't quite make out anymore. She didn't look back. Caleb drove with his attention on the road, on the horses, on the sky in the way that experienced mountain men read weather. He hadn't spoken much since they'd left the barn. Neither had she. After a while, she said, "They're going to talk about this for years." "Probably," he said. "They think you've made a mistake." He glanced sideways at her, just briefly. What do you think? She considered the question with the seriousness she gave most questions. The cold was real. The dark was real. The mountain road ahead was real in a way that the warm barn and its crowd of onlookers were already ceasing to be. I think, she said carefully, that I haven't decided yet. But I haven't decided I haven't either. He turned back to the road. That's honest. I don't have much use for the other kind. The horses moved steadily upward through the dark and the falling snow. The lights of Red Hollow disappeared entirely behind a bend in the mountain road. She straightened her back, pulled her coat tighter, and looked at the road ahead. Nobody was laughing now. The ranch appeared out of the dark and snow like something that hadn't quite decided whether it wanted to be found. Abigail saw the lights first, 2 yellow squares in the black, the windows of the main house pushing warm color into the storm. Then the shape of the barn resolved itself, large and low, and the fence line materialized out of the white as the horses slowed and Caleb guided them through a gate that someone had left propped open with a rock. A dog barked somewhere, then another. Then a man appeared in the barn doorway holding a lantern at shoulder height, and the light caught the underside of his face in a way that made him look older than he probably was. He was stocky, shorter than Caleb, wearing a wool coat that had been repaired so many times it was more patched than original fabric. He looked at the wagon. He looked at Caleb. Then he looked at Abigail sitting on the bench with snow on her shoulders and her traveling bag on her lap. And his expression did something complicated that he did not entirely manage to hide. "Pete," Caleb said, pulling the wagon to a stop. "Take the horses." Pete took the horses. He didn't say anything, but she felt his eyes on her back as Caleb helped her down from the wagon. Not an offered hand so much as a steadying presence, stepping close when the ground turned out to be more ice than she'd anticipated. She caught herself against his arm, straightened, and stepped back before it could become anything more than what it was. "Main house is through there," Caleb said, nodding toward the lights. "I'll show you where things are." The inside of the house was warm, in the way of a place that had been heated all day. Deeply, thoroughly, with the kind of heat that gets into the walls and stays. It was not a comfortable house exactly, not in the way of houses where someone had spent time making things pretty. It was a working house. Functional. A stone fireplace that dominated the main room, a table that could seat 8 but was set for 1, shelves loaded with tools and rope and jars of dried goods, alongside a few books that looked like they'd been read so many times the spines had given up. Abigail set her bag down and looked around without pretending she wasn't. "It's not much," Caleb said from behind her. "It's warm," she said. "That matters more than much tonight." She turned. He was standing just inside the door, snow still on his coat, watching her take the measure of the room with an expression she couldn't fully read. Careful, she thought. He was being careful with her in the way of a man who knows the value of something and doesn't want to break it by handling it wrong. "There's a room off the back," he said. "It's yours. I'll sleep in the far bedroom." She nodded. "I want to be plain about what I'm offering," he said. "I'm not asking you to be my wife in name only, but I'm also not asking you to be anything tonight that you haven't decided to be yet. You said you'd give this a fair trial. I mean to give you the space to do that honestly." She looked at him for a moment. "That's a more careful speech than I expected. I've had all day to think about what I was going to say when we got here. Did you know I was going to come?" A pause. "No, but I hoped." He reached up and took his hat off, turned it once in his hands, and set it on a peg by the door. "There's food on the stove if you're hungry. I'll be outside." He went back out into the snow. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment, alone, listening to the wind push against the walls. Then she went and found the kitchen. She slept badly, which she expected, in a bed that was not her own, in a house that made sounds she didn't know yet. Old houses all had their own language. The specific creak of a particular floorboard, the way the wind found a gap in the south-facing window, the rhythm of the fire settling in the next room. She lay in the dark and listened to this house's language and told herself she was gathering information. By 5 a.m, she gave up on sleep and got dressed. The kitchen was cold. She built the fire back up, found flour and salt in the lard, and had biscuits in the oven before the light outside had shifted from black to the particular dark gray that comes just before dawn. She found coffee. She made a pot. The first ranch hand through the door at 5:15 was a tall, raw-boned young man with a face full of freckles and the cautious movements of someone who had been told something surprising and wasn't sure how to act around it. He stopped dead in the kitchen doorway when he saw her. "Morning," Abigail said. "Ma'am?" He pulled his hat off, held it. I'm Jesse. Jesse, there's coffee on the stove." He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. He came in and got the coffee with the careful deliberateness of a man moving around something unpredictable. 3 more came in over the next 20 minutes. Each one stopped. Each one did their own version of the same startled recalculation. She learned their names: Jesse, Walt, a gruff older man named Dutch, who smelled like he'd already been in the barn for an hour, and a quiet young one barely out of his teens who introduced himself as Marco and then retreated to the far end of the table and didn't say much. Caleb came in last, at 5:30, with snow on his coat and the look of a man who'd been up longer than any of them. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She was pulling the biscuits out of the oven. "I found flour," she said. "Hope that's all right." Something shifted in his face. "That's more than all right." He looked at the table, at the 4 ranch hands sitting around it with coffee cups and the particular silence of men who are trying to process new information and haven't finished yet. "You eat," he said to them. "We've got fence work on the north line before the next snow comes in." Dutch reached for a biscuit first, bit into it. Didn't say anything, but his eyebrows did something that Abigail chose to interpret as positive. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the end of the table. Nobody said anything about Red Hollow. Nobody said anything about yesterday. The snow ticked against the window, and the fire worked, and the biscuits disappeared faster than she'd expected. And Abigail sat in the middle of all of it and thought, all right, this is what it is. We'll see. The first week was harder than she had anticipated, which was saying something because she had anticipated it being hard. The cold was not the polite kind of cold she'd grown up with in the lower valley. The mountain altitude made it personal. It went after your face, your fingers, the space between your shoulder blades where your coat didn't quite reach. She learned the difference between the cold that just meant it was winter and the cold that meant the temperature was dropping towards something dangerous. And she learned it quickly because the ranch didn't have time for her to learn it slowly. There was always something that needed doing. Always. Caleb had not exaggerated the work, or the difficulty of it. The fences on the north line were in worse shape than she'd been told. Whole sections where the posts had heaved up out of the frozen ground and the wire was hanging slack and useless. 2 of the water troughs had frozen solid overnight and needed to be broken open before the cattle could drink. The storage in the east barn was disorganized in a way that meant things got buried and forgotten. And twice in the first week she watched Dutch spend 20 minutes looking for something that turned out to be right there, if you knew where to put it. She didn't offer opinions. Not yet. She watched, and she worked, and she asked practical questions and said thank you when answers came, and she kept her observations to herself until she was sure enough of them to say something. The hands didn't warm up to her, not immediately. Jesse was shy around her, but not unkind. Walt was politely distant. Marco watched her the way young men watch things they can't categorize yet. Dutch was the problem, or the closest thing to one. Dutch Carver had been running Caleb's ranch operation for 3 years before she arrived, and in those 3 years he had developed a set of views about how things should go that did not include a woman arriving in a snowstorm and rearranging his sense of the place. He didn't say anything directly. He was careful enough for that. But he found ways to make himself unhelpful without being openly obstructionist. He answered her questions just slightly too late. He gave directions to the others in front of her, as if she wasn't there. When she moved the storage arrangement in the east barn, she came in the next morning to find it moved back. She stood in front of the re-scrambled shelving for a full minute. Then she went and found Dutch. He was in the horse barn, working on a bridle, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who had been expecting this and had decided to be bored by it. "The east barn," she said. "Yep. I reorganized it. I noticed. And then you reorganized it back. I know where things are the way they are," he said, and went back to the bridle. She considered several responses. Chose the plainest one. "I'm not asking you to like how I do things, Dutch. I'm asking you to let me do them. Because if we're doing this ranch together, we need the stores accessible and accounted for before the deep freeze comes. And right now they're not." He worked the leather for a moment without looking up. You've been here 6 days. I know how long I've been here. Ranch was running before you came. I know that too. She let that sit for a second. You think I don't belong here? He finally looked up. He had a blunt, honest face, the kind that didn't bother with diplomacy because it had decided long ago that the results weren't worth the effort. I think Caleb made a quick decision, he said, and I think quick decisions on a ranch like this cost more in the long run than they save. And what do you think I'm going to cost? Time, he said. Attention. Things that don't need to be complicated, getting complicated. She looked at him steadily. Then watch, she said. That's all I'm asking. Don't make up your mind before spring. He looked at her for a moment longer, then he went back to the bridle. Not agreement, but not a door slamming either. She went back to the east barn and reorganized it the way it needed to be. 2 weeks after she arrived, the first real crisis came. It was 3 a.m. when she heard it, a sound low enough that it almost blended into the wind, but with a quality to it that pushed through her sleep and brought her upright before she was fully awake. She sat in the dark, listening. There it was again. A calf. Distressed, not just cold distressed, but the particular broken quality of a newborn in trouble. She was dressed and out the door in 4 minutes. The cattle barn was lit by a single lantern turned down low, and in the nearest stall she found what she'd feared. A calf born too early, small and shaking, and the mother down on her side breathing in a way that said the birthing had taken something out of her that she didn't have to spare. The calf had made it out, but it was wet, and the temperature in the barn was not warm enough, and the mother was too spent to do what needed doing. Abigail did not stop to think about whether this was her problem to solve. She found the rough towels on the shelf by the door. Thank you, reorganized East Barn, and she went in and started working. The calf was a heifer, small enough to hold lengthwise, and she rubbed her down with a thoroughness that was more important than gentleness right now because warmth was what they needed. The calf made a sound like it was objecting, and she said, I know, just hold still, to an animal that could not understand her but seemed to respond to the steadiness of her voice regardless. What's happening? She turned. Caleb was in the barn doorway, coat over his long underwear, hair loose, one boot not fully on. Premature, she said, not stopping her hands. The mother's down. She came through, but she's exhausted. The calf needs heat. He crossed the barn in 3 steps, dropped to his knees on the other side, and his hands joined hers on the calf without any further conversation. They worked side by side in the close warmth of the stall, the wind loud outside, the lantern swinging slightly in the draft from the door. After a while, the calf stopped shaking so hard. Her legs found their way under her. She put her nose toward the mother with the tentative hopefulness of something new to the world. There, Abigail said. Caleb sat back on his heels. He looked at the calf. He looked at Abigail's hands, red from the cold and the rubbing, resting on her knees. He didn't say anything for a moment. You heard her from inside the house, he said finally. Woke me up. Dutch sleeps in the bunkhouse. He's got ears like a... He stopped, shook his head slightly. I didn't hear anything. Different kind of listening, maybe, she said. She hadn't meant it to land any particular way. But when she looked up, he was watching her with an expression that was different from the careful one he'd been carrying since Red Hollow. Less guarded. More like a man who had just gotten an answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. Different kind, he agreed quietly. They stayed until the mother was upright and the calf was nursing, crooked, uncertain, but nursing. And then they walked back to the house through snow that came up past their ankles and a sky that was beginning, barely, to consider the possibility of morning. At the door she stopped. Caleb, she said. He turned. I want to be useful here. That's not nothing to me. She looked for the right words, the plain ones. But I need to know if you actually think I can be. Because there's a difference between giving someone a fair trial and waiting for them to fail so you can say you were decent about it. He was quiet for long enough that the cold made itself known. I don't know everything yet, he said, about whether this works. I won't lie to you about that. But I'm not waiting for you to fail. That's the honest answer. Okay, she said. Is that enough for tonight? She thought about it. It's enough for tonight. She went inside. But the mountain had its own way of testing things, and it wasn't finished. The trouble with Vernon Graves came at her sideways at first. Not a confrontation, not a clear threat, but the kind of interference that announces itself as neighborly and reveals its real nature slowly. She heard the name for the first time from Walt, who mentioned that a rider had come up the South Road and left a letter for Caleb while she'd been working the fence line. She didn't ask what was in the letter. It wasn't her business yet. But she saw Caleb's face at dinner that night. The way he ate without tasting anything. The way he answered her questions about the North Pasture with answers that were correct but somewhere else. She recognized that face. It was the face of a man carrying a weight he hadn't shared yet. She didn't push. She let him carry it. 3 days later, she rode down to the supply post at the base of the mountain for flour and lamp oil. And that was where she understood for the first time what they were dealing with. The supply post was run by a man named Cole, who had been there long enough that he'd become a piece of the landscape, as fixed and reliable as the mountains themselves. He was polite to her, helped her load the supplies, and then, as she was tying down the load, said in a voice calibrated carefully to be heard only by her, "You're Caleb Ryder's wife." "I am," she said. "Then you ought to know," Cole said, still quiet, still matter-of-fact, "that Vernon Graves was in here 2 days ago telling people Caleb married you because he couldn't get anyone else to come up to that mountain. Said Caleb was in worse shape financially than anybody knew, and he'd settled for whatever he could get." She kept her hands working on the rope. "Said some other things too," Cole added. "About you specifically. That aren't worth repeating." "But you're repeating them anyway," she said. Not harshly, just noting it. "I'm telling you because he's going to say them louder," Cole said. "Graves wants that ridge land. He's been after it for 2 years. Caleb's kept saying no, and Graves has run out of patience for asking nicely." She looked at the man. "Why are you telling me and not Caleb?" "Because Caleb already knows about Graves," Cole said. "But he doesn't know yet what Graves is saying about his wife. And you seem like the kind of woman who'd rather know first." She pulled the last knot tight. "Thank you, Cole," she said. She didn't tell Caleb what Cole had said. Not immediately. She held it the way she held most things that needed thinking, carefully, turning it over, looking at it from different angles until she understood its actual shape. What she understood was this: Vernon Graves wasn't just trying to buy land. He was trying to destabilize the person living on it. The rumors about Abigail were a tool, the same way a wedge is a tool. Drive it deep enough into the right place and the whole thing splits apart. Make Caleb look desperate. Make Abigail look like a mistake. Make the ranch look like it was already failing so that when Graves came with an offer, the offer would look like rescue. She was walking back from the cattle barn the night she worked this out fully, and she stopped in the yard under a sky that was clear and brutally cold, stars enormous and indifferent overhead, and she let herself be angry about it for a minute. Just 1 minute. It was a mean, calculating thing, and it was being done by a man who had never once had to sit in the corner of a barn and wonder if someone was going to laugh at him, who had probably never been made to feel small for taking up too much space, who moved through the world with the absolute confidence of someone who had decided long ago that other people were pieces on a board and not people at all. She stood in the cold and felt the anger go through her clean. Then she let it settle into something quieter and more useful. She would not run from this. She had not come up this mountain to run from anything. But she also hadn't been prepared for what came next. She found out about it from Jesse, who heard it from a ranch hand passing through from town, that people in Red Hollow were saying Caleb Ryder had taken that oversized Boone woman out of pity, that any man willing to take her was either blind or broken, that the ranch up on the mountain was going to fail by spring, and then she'd come crawling back and her father would have to take her in again, which served Thomas Boone right for raising a daughter no decent man could want. Jesse told her because he was 22 years old and hadn't yet learned how to be strategic about information. He said it with his freckled face going red and his hat turning in his hands, stumbling over the words like he was apologizing for them as he said them. "It's all right," she told him. "It's not," he said. "It's not right, what they're saying." "No, but people say things." She looked at him. "Don't make it bigger than it needs to be, Jesse." He nodded. But he looked upset in the way that young men look upset when the world is being uglier than they'd been told it was going to be, and she felt a small, unexpected fondness for that, for his inability to just accept it. She went inside. She sat down at the kitchen table. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had trained herself out of it a long time ago because crying in Red Hollow had never done anything except give people something else to say about her. But she sat at that table in the empty kitchen and felt the weight of those words. Oversized, pity, no decent man could want. Settle on her like something physical, because that was the truth about words like that. You could know they were other people's small-mindedness and still feel them in the body, still feel them find the exact same places they'd found before and press there. She sat with it. She didn't let herself wallow in it long. That was the other thing she'd learned. You felt it, and then you got up. But she had gotten up and gotten her coat and was heading out the back door when Caleb's voice stopped her. Abigail. She turned. He was in the doorway of the main room. He had the look of a man who had just heard something and had come looking for her with a specific thing to say and was now finding that it was harder to say than he'd expected. Whatever you heard, she said before he could start. I'm not going to tell you. It doesn't matter, he said. Don't tell me you don't need to hear it. She stopped. He crossed the room and sat down at the table, not across from her, but one chair to the side, and he put his hands flat on the wood and looked at them, and then up at her. I didn't choose you out of desperation, he said. I want to be clear about that. I know what they're saying. I know what Graves has been spreading around, and I need you to hear me say plainly that it is a lie. She looked at him. I chose you, he said, because you were the first person I saw in that barn who wasn't performing something. Everybody else in that room was trying to be what they thought I wanted to see. You were just you. Annoyed about the Pruitt invoices, looking at the weather, not thinking about me at all. Something moved across his face, almost amused, almost pained. I've been alone on this mountain for a long time. I know what I need, and I need someone who doesn't disappear when things get hard. You don't disappear. I saw that in 20 minutes. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind. That's a better speech than the first one, she said. A corner of his mouth moved. I had more time to think about this one. She sat back down. They sat across that kitchen table in the cold lamplight, and she thought, this is not the life I planned, but plans are made before you know what the world actually has to offer. What the world had offered her was hard and uncertain and not even close to settled. But for the first time in as long as she could remember, it felt like it might be worth the trouble. The thing about a slow war is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come at you with a trumpet and a clear front line. It comes as a missing tool. A fence post pulled loose in the night, cattle that were in the north pasture at sundown and aren't there at sunrise. It comes as small things and then slightly less small things. And by the time you understand the shape of what's happening, you're already 3 steps behind. That was how Vernon Graves worked. Abigail had understood it in theory since her conversation with Cole at the supply post. She understood it in practice the morning she went to draw water from the east trough and found the smell before she found the source, something chemical and wrong underneath the iron smell of cold water. She crouched at the edge of the trough and put her nose close and felt the back of her throat clench. She didn't drink it. She didn't let the animals near it. She went and found Caleb. He was in the tool barn sharpening blades with the focused, rhythmic work of a man who does it often enough that his hands do it without help from the rest of him. He looked up when she came in. East trough, she said. Something's in the water. He set the whetstone down. They went together, and he crouched where she had crouched, and he put his face close, and his jaw went tight in a particular way she was beginning to recognize. The way it went when something made him angry, and he was deciding how angry to let himself be. How bad? She asked. Bad enough. He stood. Lie, maybe. Something caustic. He looked at the fence line that ran behind the trough, the fence that separated their land from the empty ridge that technically belonged to the territory and practically sat as a buffer between the Ryder Ranch and the southern roads. Someone came through in the night. Graves. Can't prove it. He said it the way you say things you know are true but can't use yet. What do we do? Dump it, clean it, move the cattle to the north water until I can check all the troughs. He turned and called across the yard for Jesse, who appeared from the direction of the bunkhouse, still pulling his second boot on. Check every trough on the property, every single one. Don't let anything drink until you've cleared it. Jesse looked at the east trough, then at Caleb's face, and the remainder of his morning sluggishness left him. Yes, sir. He was already moving. Caleb stood in the yard for a moment after Jesse left, looking at the fence line with that tight jaw, that careful fury. He's not going to stop, Abigail said. No. And you can't prove it's him. Not yet. She looked at the trough. There's going to be a next thing. Yeah. He picked up his hat from the fence post where he'd left it, turned it once, put it on. There always is with graves. The next thing took 11 days. In that time, Abigail learned more about Vernon Graves than she'd been able to piece together from Cole's careful words at the supply post. She learned it the way you learn things on a ranch, in pieces, from different people, while doing other things. From Dutch, who had thawed toward her by degrees over the previous weeks, she learned that Graves had come to the mountain territory 6 years ago with money from somewhere back east that nobody had ever been able to fully account for. He'd bought up 3 failing ranches in the lower valley in the space of 2 years, not because he wanted to run cattle, but because he wanted land. Specifically, land that sat over or beside the underground water that fed the mountain territory. In a region where drought came every few years and water was the difference between a ranch surviving and not, controlling the water meant controlling the ranchers. From Jesse, who talked more freely than he probably should have after a long day, she learned that 2 families in the lower valley had already sold to Graves under the kind of pressure that wasn't quite a threat and wasn't quite a choice. The Hendersons had lost 2 barns to fires that the county sheriff had investigated and found inconclusive. The Pruitts, the same Pruitts whose invoice she'd been carrying the day she met Caleb, had watched their cattle get sick from something in the grass before winter and had sold at half value in November rather than lose everything by spring. From Caleb himself, in pieces, on the evenings they sat at the kitchen table after dinner with the lamp between them and the wind outside, she learned what Graves actually wanted from the Ryder Ridge specifically. There's a river, Caleb said one night. He'd been looking at a survey map that was old enough to have yellowed at the folds, and he spread it flat on the table and pointed. Runs underground for about 2 miles beneath our northern slope. Comes up here. He tapped a spot on the map. And feeds down here. His finger traced a line that branched into 3 directions. If you control the source, you control all 3 branches. That's water for every ranch in this entire section of the valley. Abigail looked at the map. She looked at where the water went. She thought about the Hendersons, the Pruitts, the other names Dutch had mentioned. He wants to sell it, she said. Not use it, sell access to it. At whatever price he decides to set. Caleb folded the map back along its old creases. In a drought year, that price would be whatever people have left. She sat with that for a moment. The fire worked steadily in the next room. Outside, one of the dogs was restless about something, making short, low sounds that weren't quite barking. He's not just after the ranch, she said. No, the ranch is just what's in the way. And you're what's in the way of the ranch. He looked at her across the table. We both are now. She had known that, in the practical sense, since the water trough. But hearing it said directly was different. She met his eyes and held them, and what passed between them was not dramatic. It was just the quiet acknowledgement of 2 people who had gotten on the same side of something without quite planning to, and were now there together. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. The next thing, when it came, was cattle. 14 head gone from the east pasture overnight. The gate had been opened cleanly. No broken lock, no forced entry, just a latch that had been lifted by someone who knew what they were doing and didn't rush. The tracks in the snow went south, toward the lower roads, and disappeared into the kind of ground traffic that made them impossible to follow. Caleb rode out with Dutch and Walt at first light. They came back at noon with the tracks lost and the cattle not found, and a controlled fury in the set of Caleb's shoulders that made even Dutch, who was not a careful man around other people's moods, give him a wide berth. Abigail had spent the morning doing what she always did when something was wrong, and she couldn't act on it yet. She worked. She'd spent 3 hours reorganizing the winter grain supply in the main barn, cataloging what they had against what they needed, and doing the arithmetic that would tell her how much margin they were working with. The answer was less than she'd thought and less than was comfortable. She was still in the barn when Caleb came back, and she heard him in the yard before she saw him. Heard the controlled, deliberate way he dismounted, the single word he said to Dutch that she couldn't make out, the silence afterward. She came out. He was standing in the yard looking at the south fence line, just looking at it. Not found? She said. Not found. He turned. His face was doing the contained thing again, the thing she'd learned to read as something between exhaustion and a rage he didn't allow himself to act on carelessly. They'll be sold in 3 counties by tonight. Won't be traceable. Graves. Graves. He said the name like something he was tired of tasting. And I still can't prove it's him. No witnesses, nothing left behind, nothing to bring to the sheriff that isn't just me saying his name. The sheriff, she said. What's he? Caleb gave her a look that answered the question before he said the words. He's a man who got elected in a county where Graves has money. She absorbed that. So we're dealing with this ourselves. Until something changes, yes. She nodded slowly. She thought about what Cole had said at the supply post. He's run out of patience for asking nicely. This was the impatience taking shape then. Not a final move, not yet, but pressure being applied to see what gave first. What she needed to understand was, what would give? She looked at the ranch, at the barns, the fences, the house, the hands moving between them, at everything that had been built here and was worth protecting, at Caleb standing in his own yard looking at his own fence line like a man counting the cost of something he hadn't finished paying for. He wants you worried, she said. He wants you counting what you've lost and looking ahead at how much more there is to lose. That's how he worked the Pruitts. Caleb turned his head toward her. He's going to keep doing small things, she said, until you're so worn down by adding up small things that when the real offer comes, it looks like relief. She paused. You can't just defend. You have to give him something to think about. Such as? I don't know yet, she said, but I'm going to figure it out. She didn't get the chance to figure it out quietly because Graves didn't give her the time. 2 days later, she rode into town for supplies and walked into the middle of a conversation that stopped the moment she came through the door of Marden's general store. There were 4 women inside, 2 she recognized from the livestock auction, 1 she didn't know, and Ruth Aldgate, who was the postmaster's wife and the closest thing Red Hollow had to a newspaper. Ruth Aldgate's mouth was a very specific shape when Abigail came through the door, the shape of a sentence that has been interrupted mid-delivery and is not pleased about it. Mrs. Ryder, Ruth said. The title landed with a particular weight, which meant it had already been in the conversation. Mrs. Aldgate. Abigail went to the shelves and started pulling what she needed. Lamp oil, salt, more flour than they'd budgeted for, because she'd done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said they needed more than they'd budgeted for. Cold morning. It is, Ruth said. And then, because Ruth Aldgate was not a woman who could hold things behind her teeth for long, we were just saying we heard things have been difficult up at the Ryder place. Supply problems, I believe, was mentioned. I wasn't told about any supply problems, Abigail said. She pulled a sack of flour off the bottom shelf and checked the weight. Well, someone said what specifically? Abigail turned and looked at her directly, not aggressively, but with the complete and level attention of someone who intends to hear the full sentence. Ruth shifted. Only that, given the circumstances, it must be quite a challenge, running a place like that, for someone who wasn't raised to it. One of the other women looked at her shoes. Abigail set the flour on the counter. I was raised on a working ranch, she said pleasantly. Same as probably half the people in this room. She looked at Ruth with a steadiness that said, I see what you're doing with someone said, and I'd like you to know that I see it. Is there anything else being said that I should know about? The silence had a particular texture, the tight, breathless kind that comes when a room has been doing something and gotten caught doing it. Ruth lifted her chin. Mr. Graves was in town 2 days ago. He seemed to think that, given the challenges of the winter, Caleb might be reconsidering his position on the Ridge property. He seemed to think there might be a settlement that would benefit everyone. Mr. Graves, Abigail said, has a very active imagination. He made quite a case, Ruth said, and her voice had found its steadier social footing again, the one that presented itself as concern while doing the work of something else. For someone in your position especially, moving to a place like that, so quickly, under those circumstances, it does seem like a difficult situation to have gotten yourself into. My position, Abigail said. Well, Ruth spread her hand slightly, the gesture of a woman performing reluctant frankness. You must know what people say, dear. It was the dear that did it, not the words. The words were the same words she'd been hearing her whole life in only slightly different arrangements. It was the dear that came with it, the condescending tenderness of someone wielding pity like a blade and calling it kindness. Abigail put both hands flat on the counter. She looked at Ruth Aldgate, and she did not look away. I know exactly what people say, she said. I've been hearing it most of my life. And I'll tell you what I've noticed. The people who say it are usually trying to get me to make a smaller decision than the one I already made. She picked up her flower. The ranch isn't failing, the ridge isn't for sale, and Mr. Graves can reconsider his position on both of those facts at his leisure. She paid for her supplies. She packed them herself, efficiently, without hurrying, because hurrying would have looked like something it wasn't. She walked out of Martin's general store into the cold and the flat white light of the mountain morning, and she drove back up the road with her hands steady on the reins and her jaw aching from the things she hadn't said. She told Caleb about it that evening. All of it. The women, the conversation, what Ruth had said, and what Graves had apparently been telling people. Caleb listened without interrupting. He was sitting at the table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup and his face doing the controlled thing, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He's telling people the ranch is failing, he said. He's telling people you made a bad decision, she said. The ranch and me, both the same category of mistake. She looked at him. He's going to make an offer, publicly, I think. Somewhere it can't be quietly declined. And when I decline it, he'll make it about you being too proud to admit you're losing. She leaned forward. He's setting the story up, Caleb. He's been setting it up since before I got here. All the small things, the water, the cattle, those aren't just damage. They're proof. Every time something goes wrong, it's more evidence for the version of this story that ends with you selling. He put the cup down. He looked at her with the hawk and open sky attention that she'd stopped finding unsettling weeks ago and now just found honest. What do we do? He said. Not what do you think we should do? Just the flat, direct question of a man who was asking a partner. She had been thinking about it since the supply post, since the kitchen table conversation about the map, since she'd done the arithmetic about the grain and the water and the winter stores, and then pushed the arithmetic further, past the ranch, out into the valley, toward the problem that was bigger than either of them. The water, she said. He waited. You've been holding on to it, she said, protecting it, keeping it off the market so Graves can't take it. That makes sense. But it also means every other rancher in this valley looks at that ridge and sees something they can't have. Either Graves takes it and sells it back to them, or you hold it and they never get any different. Either way, it's out of reach. She looked at him steadily. What if it wasn't? He was very still. What if the water went to everyone, she said. A shared system. Every family in the valley gets access. Not for sale, shared. Because it's mountain water and it's not anybody's to own. She spread her hands on the table. You take away Graves's leverage by making the thing he wants to control into something that can't be controlled. And you turn every rancher in this valley from a potential Graves customer into someone with a reason to stand beside you. The fire worked in the other room. Caleb looked at her for a long time. That's most of what I have, he said. The water, the ridge, the only real card in his hand. I know, she said. You're asking me to give it away. I'm asking you to give it to the valley. She held his eyes. Which is different. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking, looked at the table, looked at her. It would have to be built, he said slowly. A system like that. Pipes, channels, a distribution point. It would cost. I know. But you'd have people helping who have never had a reason to help you before. Graves would try to stop it. Yes. It would make him angrier than anything we've done. Yes, she said again. That's part of the point. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the fire shifted and the dog settled outside the door and the cold moved against the windows in its patient, persistent way. You've been thinking about this a while, he said, since you showed me the map. He picked up the coffee cup, finally drank, set it down again. It's a risk. It's all risk, she said. The question is what kind? He looked at her with something in his face that wasn't quite the careful expression and wasn't quite anything she had a name for yet. Something that was settling into place, like ground after a frost. Like a decision made in the body before the head catches up. All right, he said. All right, we do it your way. He said it plainly, the way he said most things. Not dramatically, not reluctantly. Just as a fact he'd decided on. I'll need to talk to Dutch about what it would take to start in spring. I'll help with the plans, she said. I know you will. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. But Vernon Graves moved before spring had any intention of arriving. He came in early February, not to the ranch, but to a community gathering at the Red Hollow Church Hall, where families from a dozen different properties had assembled for the kind of midwinter meeting that served as both practical necessity and social sanity, trading information about supplies, road conditions, which passes were closed and which were passable, and what the early signs were saying about the back half of winter. Abigail was there beside Caleb, and she felt the room shift the moment Graves walked in. He was a broad, well-dressed man in his 50s, with the kind of face that had probably once been likable, and had settled over the years into something that used likability the way a trap uses bait. He wore his money the way some men wore guns, casually, as a reminder. He shook hands with a dozen men and nodded at a dozen women and worked his way through the room with the ease of someone who had done this specific calculation many times before. He reached Caleb last. "Ryder," he extended his hand. "Good to see you looking well." Caleb shook the hand once, briefly, with an expression that gave nothing away. "And Mrs. Ryder," Graves turned to Abigail and looked at her with the particular look of a man who has already decided what he sees and is merely confirming it. "I don't think we've been properly introduced." "No?" Abigail said. "We haven't." "Vernon Graves." He held out his hand. She shook it because there were 40 people in the room watching, and because sometimes you shook the hand of the thing coming at you. "I know who you are, Mr. Graves." "Good things, I hope," he said, with the practiced smile of a man who doesn't particularly care what the answer is. Then he turned back to the room. He raised his voice in the comfortable, projected way of a man who'd addressed crowds before and found it easy. "While I have everyone together," he said, "I'd like to say something about the situation on the mountain ridge. I know there's been concern about water access for the coming year, given how dry last autumn ran." He paused for exactly the right amount of time. "I've made a fair offer to Caleb Ryder for the ridge property, a very fair offer, that would allow me to develop the water resource there into something the whole valley could benefit from, for a reasonable fee, of course." Murmurs moved through the room. "Caleb's been reluctant," Graves continued, his voice carrying just the edge of understanding about reluctance. "And I respect that it's hard to let go of land. But I want everyone here to understand that if the ridge stays as it is, unmanaged, undeveloped, that water isn't helping anyone. And another dry year like last year." He let the sentence land and sit. "Well, people remember what a dry year costs." He looked at Caleb. A public look. A look that said, "Say something now, in front of all of them, and whatever you say I've already planned for." Caleb started to speak. But it was Abigail who spoke first. She said it clearly, in a room full of people she mostly didn't know, in a voice that was not loud but was completely steady. "Actually, Mr. Graves, we've been working on a plan to open the water to the valley." The murmur changed quality. "A shared system," she said, and looked not at Graves but at the ranchers around the room, at their faces, at the winter-worn, calculation-tired faces of people who had been worried about next year's water since last year's drought. "No fees, no one controlling access. Built together, maintained together, belonging to the valley." She paused. "We'll need help, and we'll need spring to get here, but it's what we're planning to do." Graves looked at her. For the first time, that likable trap face showed something that wasn't calculated. It was only there for a moment, a second, maybe less, but she saw it. He had not planned for her. He recovered smoothly because he was a man with a great deal of practice at recovering. "That's a very generous idea," he said, with the tone of a man explaining why a child's drawing isn't quite ready for a gallery. "But the practical realities of building a water system. We've done the plans," she said, "and we have the land. What we need is people." She looked at the room again. "That's what we're asking for." The room was very quiet. Then a man in the back, older, gray-bearded, the kind of face that had been burned and frozen so many times it looked like geography, said, "What kind of help?" And just like that, the conversation stopped being Vernon Graves's. He didn't say anything more that evening. He was good enough at this to know when a room had turned, and he left before the meeting ended, quietly, with his coat and his practiced smile and the look of a man who was already working on the next move. Abigail watched him go. Caleb was beside her talking to the gray-bearded man, whose name turned out to be Hector Aldane, and who ran the largest spread in the South Valley, and had, apparently, already lost one water negotiation to Graves that he had very pointed feelings about. She felt Caleb's hand brush her arm, briefly, as he turned to answer Hector's question. It might have been accidental. She didn't think it was accidental. Outside, the mountain cold waited for all of them. The road home was icy and long, and the work ahead of them was the kind that would take everything they had, and there were no guarantees that any of it would turn out the way they were planning. But she had looked at Vernon Graves's face in the moment he hadn't been ready for her, and she had seen something useful there. He thought she was a weakness. He had been building his whole approach around the idea that she was the soft point, the hasty choice, the desperate grab, the thing Caleb had taken on that would make him easier to break. He had spent months working that angle, and he had just found out what it actually was. Graves's next move came 12 days after the church hall meeting, and it came the way his moves always came, sideways, in the dark, dressed up as something else. It started with the barn. Abigail woke at 2 a.m. to the smell of smoke. Not the familiar, contained smell of the fireplace or the cook stove. The wrong kind. The outdoor kind. The kind that had no business being inside a cold mountain night. She was out of bed and into her boots before she was fully conscious of deciding to move. And she hit the back door to run and saw the orange glow before she cleared the porch steps. The east storage barn was on fire. Not catching fire, already burning, the kind of burn that meant it had been going for long enough to make headway into the dry winter timber before anyone had noticed. The flames were 20 feet up on the south wall, climbing with the confidence of something that had been given a good start, and the wind was pushing them north toward the main barn where they kept the horses. She screamed for Caleb. She screamed for the hands. She was already running toward the well before she heard the bunkhouse door slam open behind her. What followed was the worst 40 minutes of her time on the mountain. They formed a line from the well. There was no other option. Not enough hands, not enough equipment, not anything close to what you'd need to fight a fire like that properly. She worked the bucket alongside Jesse and Marco and Dutch, and a ranch hand named Tomas, who'd arrived 2 weeks ago and hadn't said much but worked like a man who understood consequences. Caleb was at the front of the line, at the fire itself, closer than was safe, directing water at the north wall to keep the flames from jumping to the horse barn. She could feel the heat from 40 feet away. The cold night air and the fire's heat made a war on her face. Ice on one cheek, scorching on the other, and no comfortable place in between. The east barn was lost. They all understood that inside the first 10 minutes. The question was what else they could save. She kept her arms moving. Pull, pass, pull, pass. The bucket handles cut into her palms through her gloves. She could hear Jesse behind her breathing in the ragged, effortful way of someone who has passed their comfortable limit and working on something else entirely. "Keep going," she said, without turning around, because she could feel him starting to slow. "I'm going," he said. "I know. Keep going." At some point, Marco took over for Tomas on the far end, and she didn't fully register when. At some point, the wind shifted, just slightly, 5 degrees east, and that was the thing that saved the horse barn, the wind and nothing else, because their bucket line was not going to be enough on its own. The east barn collapsed inward at 20 past 3 in the morning, and the sound it made was a deep concussion that moved through the ground and up through her feet and settled somewhere in her chest like an impact. They stood in the yard after, all of them, watching the ruins burn down to themselves in the cold. Nobody said anything for a while. Dutch had a burn on his left forearm where a brand had fallen from the wall and glanced off him. He was holding it with his right hand and looking at the smoldering wreckage with an expression that was too tired for anger and not past it either. Jesse sat down in the snow. Caleb stood at the edge of what had been the door of the east barn and looked into it, and his back was to all of them, and Abigail couldn't see his face. She went and stood beside him. The heat still pushed out of the wreckage even in the mountain cold. Inside, she could see the shapes of what was gone. The organized shelves she'd arranged and rearranged, the grain stores, the winter equipment, the small, stupid inventory of a working ranch that takes months to accumulate and hours to burn. "How much did we lose?" she asked. "Enough." His voice was flat. 6 weeks of grain, maybe 7. 3 sets of fence tools. The extra harness. He was quiet. The breeding records for the past 2 years. That last one landed differently. Not because it was the most expensive thing, but because it couldn't be replaced. "I'm sorry," she said. He didn't say anything. She looked at his profile in the orange light, the tight jaw, the eyes that were doing the counting again, the specific look of a man adding up what he has left against what he's going to need. She had seen that look since she arrived, and she understood it better now than she had in the beginning. It wasn't defeat, but it was the thing that could become defeat if it sat too long without something beside it. "Caleb," she said. He turned his head. "He wants you standing exactly where you're standing," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "Counting what's gone. That's the point of this." He looked at her. His eyes were red from the smoke and the sleeplessness and possibly something else, though she didn't press on that. "I know," he said. "So don't give him the satisfaction of looking like a man who's been beaten." A long pause. "I don't feel like a man who hasn't been." "I know that too," she said. "But you've still got a horse barn and cattle and a working well and 6 men who just stood in a bucket line for 40 minutes. That's not nothing." He looked back at the ruins. "We're going to be short on grain before winter breaks." "I'll figure out the grain," she said. He looked at her. "I'll figure out the grain," she said again. "That's my part. You figure out how we're going to keep graves from burning something else." She figured out the grain the way she figured out most things, by understanding what she had and working outward from there. She went back through the winter stores with Dutch the following morning, both of them moving through the surviving barn with the focused attention of people counting very carefully. And what they found was not as bad as the worst possibility and not as good as comfortable. "We can stretch the cattle feed if we bring the herd in tighter," Dutch said. He was crouching by the far shelving, checking moisture damage from the proximity of the fire. The bandage on his forearm was already working loose at one end, but he wasn't paying attention to it. "Keep them from ranging, save the energy cost. Drop some weight on them before spring, but they make it." "What about the horses?" "Horses are the problem." He stood up, looked at the numbers she'd written in the margin of the supply ledger. "We're 2 months short on the horses if winter goes long." "Hector Aldane," she said. Dutch looked at her. "He has stores," she said. "He told Caleb he wanted to help after the church hall meeting. That wasn't just talk. That was a man with a specific grievance against graves looking for a way to make it useful." She looked at Dutch. "Ride down to Aldane's place and tell him what happened. Tell him what we need and tell him what it's for." Dutch was quiet for a moment. He had that blunt, honest face that she'd come to understand didn't hide much if you knew how to read it, and what it was doing right now was the thing it did when he was reconsidering something he'd thought he'd already decided. "You think he'll come through," he said. "I think a man who just watched you publicly refuse Vernon Graves in a room full of people has a personal interest in you not losing," she said. "Yes." Dutch picked up his coat from the nail by the door. "I'll go this morning." She almost said thank you and then didn't, because Dutch was past the point of needing her to say thank you for things like this, and they both knew it. He was back by late afternoon with the news that Aldane would send a supply wagon within 3 days, and that 3 other families from the South Valley had heard about the fire and were asking whether there was anything they could do. She had not expected the 3 families. She sat with that information for a few minutes in a way she didn't show to anyone. People were paying attention. That was what Vernon Graves had not calculated, that burning the barn would not just hurt the Ryder Ranch, but would show the rest of the valley exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. There were ranchers in this territory who had been watching Graves work for 3 years and had made their private calculations about him and said nothing because saying something cost more than it returned. The barn changed the math on that. A man who burns a barn in the middle of winter in mountain country is a man saying he doesn't care what it costs you to lose, and everybody in the valley who had animals and structures and families understood in their bones what that meant. The public offer came 6 days after the fire. Graves sent a man with a letter, a formal written offer for the Ridge property, professionally drafted, with a number attached to it that was high enough to be insulting in the way that very high offers are insulting. High enough to say, "I know you're desperate, and I know exactly how desperate." The letter was delivered not just to the ranch, but, Abigail found out from Jesse, to the sheriff's office and apparently the general store, copies, so that the offer and Caleb's response to it would be public knowledge regardless. Caleb read the letter at the kitchen table while she stood at the stove and said nothing. He put it down. "No," he said. She turned. "That's all?" That's all. He pushed the letter to the edge of the table, away from him, the way you push away something you've tasted and won't be finishing. He thinks the barn changed things. It did change things, just not the things he thought. Caleb looked at her. I need to go into town. I need to be in front of people when I decline this. He tapped the letter. He made it public. The refusal needs to be public too. I'm coming, she said. Abigail, I'm coming, she said again, and turned back to the stove in a way that closed the conversation. They rode into Red Hollow the following afternoon, the two of them, in a sky that was the specific gray-white of a storm thinking about arriving. Caleb brought the refusal letter, written himself, in the plain, direct language of a man who doesn't dress things up. And they went to the sheriff's office first because that was where Graves had sent his copy, and because Abigail had thought carefully about where the ground would be most solid. The sheriff was a compact, carefully neutral man named Driscoll, who had the specific talent of people in difficult political positions, the ability to be in a room without taking up any particular position in it. He received Caleb's refusal with the professional blankness of someone processing paperwork and nothing more. Graves was there, not by accident. Abigail was certain. He was standing at the side of the room when they came in, talking to a man she didn't recognize, and he turned when the door opened with the slight, satisfied look of a man who had arranged for something to happen and is now watching it arrive on schedule. Ryder, he said. He saw Abigail, and his expression did the thing it had done at the church hall. A very small recalculation, smoothed over quickly. Mrs. Ryder, I'm glad you're both here. I hoped we might talk. We're here to file a refusal, Caleb said. He handed the letter to Driscoll without looking at Graves. I understand that, Graves said, and I respect it, but I wonder if you've fully considered, given what happened last week. He paused with the careful sympathy of a man who had arranged what happened last week. Whether this is really the right time to be turning down options. Caleb looked at him. What happened last week was arson. Somebody set that fire. That's a serious accusation, Graves said. I haven't accused anyone, Caleb said. Yet. The room was quiet with the particular quality of people listening without wanting to look like they're listening. Graves spread his hands in the reasonable gesture. All I'm saying is that isolated ranches on the mountain face certain realities, and my offer is generous, for both of you. His eyes moved to Abigail, and what was in them was the thing he kept smoothed over but couldn't entirely cover, the dismissal, the certainty that she was the lever. It would give you both a chance to start fresh, somewhere less difficult. She felt Caleb's posture change beside her, the slight dangerous shift of a man who has just had his wife spoken to in a particular tone. But she put her hand on his arm, not dramatically, just briefly, a touch that said, I have this. And she spoke before he could. Mr. Graves, she said, what exactly are you suggesting would be less difficult? He looked at her with the patient expression of someone about to explain something simple. A place like that mountain ranch, the winters, the isolation, the demands of it. For a woman especially, I helped build a bucket line in a burning yard at 2 a.m, she said. I've been calculating grain stores and negotiating supply deals since the freeze hit. I've done the survey on the underground water, and I've drafted the plans for a shared distribution system that would serve 14 ranches in this valley. She held his eyes. What about that sounds difficult for a woman? Graves looked at her. The room had gone very still. The ridge isn't for sale, she said. The water is going to the valley. Not to you, not for a fee, not for any offer you can put a number to. That's been decided. She looked at him with a steadiness that cost her something to maintain because she was angry, and not all of that anger could be put to use. Some of it just had to be held. What you should be thinking about is what happens next when every rancher in this territory understands that you burned a barn in winter, because they're working that out right now. Graves looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him with no expression at all, which was, she had learned, the most dangerous thing Caleb Ryder's face could do. File the refusal, Driscoll, Caleb said. Driscoll filed it. They walked out. On the street outside, Caleb let out a slow breath into the cold air. That was a considerable thing you said in there, he said. Was it wrong? No. He looked at her sideways. It was right, all of it. A pause. Where did the 14 ranches number come from? I counted them from the Valley Survey map 3 weeks ago. He was quiet for a moment. "You've been planning this a while." "I told you I would," she said. They were walking toward the wagon when she heard it. Voices, behind them, from the small group of men who'd been standing near the sheriff's office. Not directed at them, not quite, but audible. "Did you hear her?" "I heard her." 14 ranches. She kept walking, but something in her chest had shifted, the same way something had shifted on the night of the calf. A small, careful loosening of something she'd been holding tight for a long time without knowing she was holding it. The blizzard came 3 days before anyone was ready for it. The older ranchers had felt it coming in their bones and said as much, but feeling a thing coming and being fully prepared for it are two different states. And the storm that hit the mountain territory in the third week of February was not the kind of storm that cared about preparation. It came in from the northwest overnight with the force of something that had been building for weeks over open country and had finally found a mountain range to spend itself against. Abigail woke to a world that had become a single color. White moving through white, so thick that the barn was invisible from the house window 20 feet away. "That's a bad one," Jesse said from behind her, looking over her shoulder at the window, his coffee cup halfway to his face and staying there. "Yes," she said. Caleb was already in his gear at the door. "North herd is still in the upper pasture," he said. "We need to bring them down before the drifts cut off the trail." "I'll go," she said. "I'll go," he said. "We'll both go," Dutch said from the corner, pulling on his second boot. "Stop the argument." They brought the north herd down through driving snow and wind that hit your face like small thrown stones, and it took 3 hours and the loss of feeling in 2 of Abigail's fingers for 20 minutes until circulation came back, and one steer who decided the storm was preferable to being moved and required individual persuasion, and everyone arrived back at the main barn cold through and short-tempered and exhausted. That was before noon. At 2 in the afternoon, the drifts had closed the mountain road. No one was getting in or out. At 4 in the afternoon, 3 ranch families from the lower mountain slopes appeared at the gate on foot. The Caraway family, 8 people including 4 children under 10, and 2 ranch hands from a property to the west whose access road had filled in faster than the main road and had left them stranded. They'd walked 2 miles in the blizzard following the fence line. "Come in," Abigail said before anyone else said anything. She said it without looking at Caleb for permission, because she didn't need to, and because she felt him behind her nodding before she'd finished the sentence. The main lodge filled up. Wet coats on every hook. Children who'd been frightened going quiet in the warmth, doing the thing exhausted children do, finding corners, finding laps, finding sleep. The 2 stranded hands were named Purvis and Carol, and both of them had the look of men who were embarrassed to need help and were deciding to be grateful instead. Abigail cooked. There was no complicated decision involved. There were a lot of people and they needed to eat. She put Walt on the bread because Walt, as it turned out, was the best bread maker on the ranch, and everyone knew it except possibly Walt, who was modest about it. She found the dried beans that would go furthest and started them early. She found the smoked ham she'd been saving and decided this was the occasion. The Caraway mother, a small, exhausted woman named Grace, who had 4 children, 2 of whom were still crying softly, and who had been walking through a blizzard and trying not to show her fear about it, sat at the kitchen table and watched Abigail work. "Can I help?" Grace said. "There's a pot that needs stirring," Abigail said. "Every few minutes." Grace got up and stirred. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. There was a kind of communication in working side by side in a kitchen with snow trying to come through every gap in the wall, and it didn't require words. At some point, Abigail felt a small hand take hold of 2 of her fingers. Not her whole hand, just 2 fingers, the way small children reach for things that seem reliable. She looked down. One of the Caraway children, a boy of about 4 with a runny nose and enormous worried eyes. She didn't say anything. She kept working, and she let him hold her fingers. Graves's riders came at 7 in the evening. She heard them before she saw them. The wrong kind of noise in the yard. Too many horses for a delivery, too purposeful for anyone seeking shelter. She was at the window before Jesse was, and what she saw through the snow and the dark was a group of 6 men on horses at the gate, and 2 of them were carrying the kind of equipment that is not standard for a courtesy call. Caleb was beside her in a moment. "They're here to take the deed papers," he said quietly. "Not a question." Graves figured the storm was cover. She looked at the room, at the children, the families, the exhausted hands, at Dutch, who had seen the riders through the window and was already moving toward the back room where the rifles were kept, at Grace Caraway, who had gone white and very still. "Dutch," Caleb said. "I see them," Dutch said. "Don't do anything yet." "I know." But he went to the back room anyway. Caleb reached for his coat. "Wait," Abigail said. He stopped. She was thinking fast, the way she thought in the situations that didn't allow for deliberate calculation, not planning so much as reading the situation for what it was and what it could become. 6 armed men in a blizzard, a lodge full of families, a confrontation here, in the dark, in these conditions, with children 10 feet away. The answer to that was not rifles, or not rifles first. "Let me go out," she said. "Absolutely not." "Caleb." She turned and looked at him. 6 armed men. You go out there angry and something breaks, and it breaks badly. Let me go out first. I can find out what they actually have, whether they've got papers, whether this is authorized by anyone, or it's just Graves running a bluff because he thinks we're cut off. She held his eyes. "If it's a bluff, we deal with it differently than if it's real. I need 2 minutes." He looked at her. She could see him calculating the same things she'd just calculated, running the same math, arriving at the same answer he didn't want to arrive at. 2 minutes, he said. "I'm at the door." "I know," she said. She put her coat on. She went out into the blizzard. The cold hit her like a hand. The wind was serious about itself, not gusting, but sustained, the kind that leaned on you continuously and made every step forward feel like an argument. She pushed through it to the gate and stopped in front of the 6 riders. The man at the front was one she half recognized. She'd seen him at the edges of a few conversations, around the supply post, one of the men that appeared where Graves's interests appeared. He was looking at her with the specific expression of someone who had prepared for a confrontation with a rancher, and gotten his rancher's wife, and wasn't sure how to update his plan. "You're here for the deed papers," she said. Over the wind, loud enough to carry. He looked at her. "We're here to... Mr. Graves has a legal claim." "Mr. Graves has a rejected offer and a filed refusal that's sitting in the sheriff's office right now," she said. "Whatever he told you about a legal claim, show me the paperwork." A pause. "Show me," she said, "because if you have valid legal paperwork, I'll let you come in out of the storm while we look at it and figure out what's what, and if you don't..." She looked down the line of them, at the men behind the first rider, at the snow coming at them sideways. "Then you rode out in a blizzard for nothing, and there are families inside that lodge, including children who are cold and scared, and you should ask yourself what you're doing here and whose interests you're actually serving." The first rider looked at her. Behind him, one of the other men shifted in his saddle, an uncomfortable movement. "Show me the papers," she said again, quieter this time, because she'd heard something shift and she was giving it room. The first rider reached into his coat. He didn't produce papers. He produced nothing. His hand came back out empty and he looked at it for a moment and then at her. "We don't have papers," he said, quietly, like he was confessing something. "Then Graves sent you here to frighten people," she said. "That's what this is." He didn't answer. She looked at him steadily. "Get off his payroll," she said. "I mean that as plainly as I can. He burned a barn and he sent you out in a blizzard, and he told you to ride armed onto a property where families are taking shelter. That's the man you're working for." The wind pushed between them. Then the man 2 positions back. Not the first rider, the one she'd been talking to, but a different one, younger, with snow built up on his hat brim, said, "She's right." Nobody moved for a moment. Then he turned his horse. Then the man beside him. One by one, without a word from the first rider, they turned and went back into the storm. The first rider sat for another moment. He looked at her, not with the expression he'd arrived with, but with something more complicated that she didn't have a name for, and wasn't sure he did either. Then he turned his horse and followed the others. She stood at the gate and watched them go until they were gone into the white. Her hands were shaking by the time she turned around, though she hadn't let them shake while she was standing at the gate. The cold had gone through her coat somewhere in that exchange and had settled into her back. Her face felt like it belonged to someone else. Caleb was at the door of the lodge. She walked back through the snow and up the steps, and he held the door, and she went in. The warmth hit her like something physical. "Papers?" he said. "None," she said. He looked at her face. Then he reached out and put both his hands around her shaking ones, briefly, and the heat of his palms went through her fingers before he let go. "Come eat something," he said. They found out about the dam at 11 that night. Purvis, one of the stranded ranch hands who'd walked through the blizzard with the caraways, had been checking Caleb's fence line on the east side. Something to do, something useful, the kind of restless helpfulness of a man who didn't like to sit idle. And he came back inside, stamping snow off his boots, with his face carrying the particular look of someone who has just found something they did not want to find. "There's water," he said, "coming down the east slope. A lot of it." Caleb and Abigail looked at each other. "The runoff dam," Caleb said. He told her about it weeks ago, an earth dam on the upper east slope that managed the snowmelt runoff away from the lower valley settlements when the thaw came hard. It was an old structure, hand-built by whoever had first ranched this land, and it was not in the best condition because nothing on the mountain was in the best condition, and there were only so many hours in a working day. "In this snow," she said. "If the dam gave way—" "In this snow," she said again, meaning the weight of it, the melt that was already happening from the burn of the blizzard working against the mountain's cold stores, the specific bad luck of a storm of this size in a year when the ground was already saturated. It could send water all the way down to the valley settlements. He was pulling his coat back on. "I'm coming," she said. "Abigail." "The families in the lower settlement," she said. "The ones we were talking about helping. The ones who came to the church hall meeting." She looked at him directly. "I'm coming." Dutch was already at the door. Jesse stood up from the bench. "Someone stays with the families," Caleb said. "Walt, Marco, you stay. The rest of us go." They went out into the blizzard. What followed was 2 hours that she did not fully organize into sequence until much later, when it was over and she could look back at it from a distance. The mountain in a full blizzard at night was not a place designed for human movement. The trail to the upper slope was buried past the knee in places, and the wind was no longer merely sustained but actively hostile, coming in pulses that stopped you mid-step and required you to lean into before it let you go. Her lantern went out twice, and she lit it twice, and the third time she put it out herself and navigated by the snowlight and the lantern ahead of her, which was Dutch's, a yellow smear moving through the white. They found the dam by the sound of it, the specific pressured sound of a structure trying to contain something that had grown past what it was built for. The east face was already seeping, brown water finding its way through the packed earth in thin, fast lines, and the snowpack above it was the wrong color in the lantern light, dark and saturated. "It's going to go," Dutch said. He was looking at the face with the expression of a man who knows structures. "Could be an hour, could be 20 minutes. "The Henderson place is directly below," Caleb said, "and the Aldane South pasture." 14 families, Abigail said. They looked at each other in the lantern light, snow on every surface, the wind pushing its continuous argument. "We can't stop it," Dutch said. "Not with what we've got, not in this storm." "No," Abigail said, "but we can warn them." She looked at Caleb. "Split up. You and Dutch go to Henderson and the South settlements. Jesse, you go west along the ridge to the Parson Holdings." She looked at Jesse, who was 22 years old and standing in a blizzard in the middle of the night on a mountain slope, and who was scared but not quite scared enough to stop. "You know the way?" "I know the way," he said. "Go fast and don't stop for anything except people." He went. She went east, toward the Caraway homestead, because the Caraways were already at the lodge, but their neighboring family, the Millers, 4 adults and 2 children, were not, and their property sat in the path of the worst of the water flow. She found the Miller house dark and had to pound on the door for a full minute before a light appeared. The man who opened it looked at her, at the woman standing on his porch in a full blizzard at midnight with ice in her hair and snow to her knees, with an expression that moved through confusion and alarm and arrived somewhere at the edge of panic. "Water's coming off the east slope," she said. "Get your family up to the Ryder Lodge, now. Don't pack, don't wait. Get your people and go." He stared at her. "Now," she said. "I mean it." He got his people and went. By the time the dam gave, not all at once, but in the way these structures fail, section by section, each failure speeding the next, the water ran largely through empty land, through evacuated paths, through pastures where animals had been moved and properties where families were already on higher ground. It ran hard and it ran cold, and in the morning it would have done damage that would take weeks to undo. But when the sun came up, nobody counted their dead. They counted each other. 17 families in and around the Ryder Lodge spread across every surface that could hold a body. Children who'd fallen asleep mid-sentence. Men and women who'd been strangers 3 months ago, sitting shoulder to shoulder with their boots still on. Abigail was at the stove at first light, starting the fire back up, finding the coffee, finding anything that was still available to feed people with. Jesse came back in at 6 in the morning, frost on his face and his hat, and he sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his arms and didn't say anything for a full minute. Then he looked up. "Everybody got out," he said. She put a cup of coffee in front of him. "Good," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was very tired and her hands were raw from the cold, and there was a bruise on her hip from where she'd fallen on the trail going east that she hadn't noticed until now. And the lodge was full of people who needed things, and there was a lot of work still to do. But everybody had gotten out. She stood at the stove in the gray morning light and let that be enough, just for a moment before she went back to work. The morning after the blizzard broke, Sheriff Driscoll rode up the mountain road. He came alone, which meant something. A man who comes with deputies comes for an arrest or a show of force. A man who comes alone comes because he has something to say that he hasn't decided how to say yet. Abigail saw him from the yard where she was helping the Miller family load their wagon for the trip back down to their property. The water damage to the lower slopes had been significant. Fences down, a section of the Aldane South pasture scoured flat, 2 outbuildings on the Henderson property pushed off their foundations. But the houses had held and the families were whole, and the morning had the specific quality of the day after a bad thing where people move through wreckage and feel, underneath the exhaustion, the complicated relief of still being there to move through it. Driscoll pulled up near the main gate and dismounted and looked at the yard. At the families, the wagons, the organized movement of people who had come through something together. He had the expression of a man doing a recalculation. Caleb came out of the barn. "Driscoll," he said. "Ryder." The sheriff held his hat in his hands the way men hold hats when they've come to say something they'd rather not be saying. "I need to talk to you about Graves." "All right," Caleb said. "Talk." Driscoll glanced at Abigail. She didn't move. "One of his riders came to my office this morning," Driscoll said. "The one who led the group that came up here during the storm." He paused. "He told me what Graves sent them to do, and he told me about the barn." Another pause, longer. "He's willing to make a statement." The yard had gotten quieter around them. Not everyone was listening, but enough people were. "The rider who turned back," Abigail said. Driscoll looked at her. "Yes, ma'am." She remembered him. The first rider at the gate, the one who'd reached into his coat and come out with nothing. The one who'd sat on his horse after the others had turned and looked at her with that complicated expression she hadn't been able to name. "What made him come forward?" Caleb asked. "He said—" Driscoll turned his hat once in his hands. "He said a woman stood at a gate in a blizzard and asked him what he was doing and whose interests he was serving, and he went home and thought about it." He looked at Abigail again, and this time there was something different in it. Not the careful neutrality of a man managing a political situation, but something more straightforward. He said he couldn't answer the question to his own satisfaction. Abigail looked at the mountain. She didn't say anything. "I need Caleb to come in and make a formal statement," Driscoll said. "About the water, about the cattle, about the barn." He put his hat back on. "I should tell you, there are people in town who've been waiting for someone to give them a reason to say something about Graves. Looks like they've got one now." What followed was not a clean, swift thing. It was paperwork and statements and the kind of legal process that moves the way glaciers move, with enormous force and no visible speed. It took 3 weeks before the formal charges against Graves were filed, and another 2 before he was brought in front of a county judge who had been sent up from the territorial capital specifically because the local judicial situation had what the paperwork called conflict of interest concerns, which was a formal way of saying that everyone knew Graves had his hand in the local court, and nobody wanted the case thrown out on that account. In those 5 weeks, the valley changed. It changed the way things change when a pressure that's been building for a long time finally finds a release. Not all at once, not neatly, but in the accumulation of small things that add up to something different. Families who had been doing their separate calculations in separate kitchens started talking to each other in ways they hadn't before the blizzard. The Hendersons rode up to the Ryder Ranch 2 weeks after the storm and spent a full day helping repair the fence line that the runoff water had damaged. Hector Aldane sent the promised grain wagon and came with it himself, and he and Caleb spent 4 hours at the kitchen table with the survey maps and Abigail's water distribution plans spread between them, going through it section by section. "This is workable," Aldane said at the end of those 4 hours. He was looking at the plans with the focused, unsentimental attention of a man who has been farming long enough to know the difference between a good idea and a good idea that can actually be built. "It's going to take everyone's spring labor for a month, maybe 6 weeks, but it's workable." "We know that," Caleb said. Aldane looked at Abigail. "You drew these up." "Caleb helped," she said. "I held the lamp," Caleb said. Aldane almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood. "There are 11 families in this valley who owe you a month of spring labor," he said. "I'll start making the rounds." He did make the rounds. And it turned out that a month of promised spring labor, when you actually went and asked for it from people who had recently been through a blizzard together and had a specific concrete reason to understand what was at stake, was not as hard to collect as it might have seemed. The hearing for Vernon Graves was held in the county seat, a full day's ride south of Red Hollow, and Abigail did not attend. She had been asked, and she had thought about it, and she had decided that she was more useful on the mountain than in a courtroom where her role would be to sit and watch and have no hand in the proceedings. Caleb went. Dutch went. The writer, whose name she had learned was Frank Selby, went and gave his statement in front of the judge with his hat in his hands and his voice steady. She heard about it afterward from Caleb, who came home after 2 days with the look of a man who had put something down that he'd been carrying a long time. "Guilty on the arson," he said, sitting down at the kitchen table with his coat still on. "Guilty on theft of cattle, and the territorial court is opening a separate investigation into the Henderson and Pruitt land deals, whether there was coercion." He looked at the table. "He'll do time. How much depends on the investigation?" She poured him coffee. He wrapped his hands around the cup. "It's done," she said. "Mostly." He looked up. "His properties are frozen pending the investigation. His operation in the valley is stopped." He was quiet for a moment. "It's not everything. He'll still have money when he gets out. He'll still be who he is." "I know," she said, "but the water's ours, and the valley knows what he is." He nodded slowly. "That's enough," she said. He looked at her. "Is it? For you?" She thought about it honestly because he was asking honestly. She thought about the barn she would never fully stop being angry about. The cattle. The months of pressure and small sabotages and the specific cruelty of a man who treated people as pieces on a board. The things he'd said and arranged to be said about her in particular. "It won't undo any of it," she said. "But yes, it's enough." She sat down across from him. "Frank Selby," she said. "What happened to him?" "I offered him a job," Caleb said. She looked at him. "He's a good hand," Caleb said. "Better than working for Graves, clearly." A pause. "He asked me if you'd forgiven him." "For what?" "For showing up at the gate in the first place." She was quiet for a moment. "Tell him that's not the part I remember," she said. "The part I remember is what he did after." Caleb looked at her with the expression she'd come to know best. The one that wasn't the careful look or the hawk in open sky look, but the one that was just him, without the armor of either. The one she'd seen in the cattle barn at 3 a.m, and at the kitchen table with the survey maps, and at the gate of the church hall on the night everything shifted. "All right," he said. "I'll tell him." Spring came to the mountain the way spring always came up there, reluctantly, in stages, with several false starts and one last freeze in late March that killed the early shoots and made everyone who'd planted too soon feel foolish about it. But it came. The construction of the water system began in the first week of April when the ground was soft enough to work. 11 families sent people. Hector Aldane brought 4 hands and equipment. The Hendersons came with their 2 oldest sons and a determination that had something personal in it, something about proving to themselves that what had happened to them with the Pruitt land deals was not the final word on their situation. Grace Caraway came with her husband and left her 4 children in the care of the older Miller girl, and she worked the pipe trenches with a focused intensity that Abigail recognized because she'd seen it in the mirror. It was not graceful work. Pipe trenches in mountain soil hit rock every 20 feet and had to be negotiated around, and the distribution point that Abigail had drawn on paper turned out to be in a location that required a retaining wall nobody had accounted for, which cost them 4 days and considerable profanity from Dutch, who was the closest thing they had to a structural authority. "This wall goes here," Dutch said, standing in the trench with his boots wet, pointing at a spot that was clearly not where Abigail had drawn it. "It can't go there," she said. "The grade is wrong." "The grade is fine." "Dutch, water runs downhill. If we put the wall there, the whole eastern branch runs into the Henderson Foundation." Dutch looked at the grade. He looked at the wall location. He looked at Abigail. "It goes here," he said, pointing to where she'd originally indicated. "Yes," she said. "I knew that," he said, and climbed out of the trench. Jessie, who was nearby, caught Abigail's eye and looked very carefully at the middle distance. 6 weeks after construction began, water ran. It ran from the mountain source through the main channel to the distribution point, and from there along 3 branch lines that served 14 properties in the valley. It ran cold and clear and absolutely indifferent to who had tried to own it, and the sound it made going through the new pipes on a May morning was the most ordinary, unremarkable sound imaginable. Just water moving through a channel, doing what water does. Hector Aldane stood at the distribution point and watched it run for a long moment. "Well," he said. That was all he said. But there were a lot of people standing around that distribution point who felt the same thing he did and didn't have the words for it either, and the silence that held between all of them was not an empty silence. It was the kind that's full of something that doesn't need to be said to be understood. Abigail had not expected what came after. She had expected the water system to be a practical thing, which it was. She had expected it to help ranches survive the next dry year, which it would. She had not expected the way it changed the texture of things between people in the valley, the way a shared thing built by shared work becomes something more than its physical function. Families started coming to the Ryder Ranch not just for practical reasons, but for no particular reason, the way people go to a place that has become a reference point for them. A neighbor would stop in on the way to somewhere else and stay for an hour and leave having fixed a fence section, or helped reorganize a section of the main barn, or just sat at the kitchen table and talked through a problem they'd been holding alone. Grace Caraway came back in late May with a jar of preserved plums and no announced reason, and spent an afternoon helping Abigail plant the kitchen garden that Abigail had been meaning to get to but hadn't had time for. "You don't have to," Abigail started. "I know I don't have to," Grace said, already on her knees in the dirt. They planted in a comfortable silence, and after a while Grace said, without looking up from the work, "My oldest girl wants to know if she can come up here on Saturdays. Said she wants to learn how you do the ranch accounts." Abigail looked at her. "How old is she?" 13. "She can come," Abigail said. Grace nodded. They kept planting. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that doesn't announce itself as significant. But Abigail thought about it afterward, about what it meant that a woman was sending her 13-year-old daughter to learn ranch accounts, what that woman was trying to give her daughter that she maybe hadn't had herself. The idea that there was something worth knowing, that the knowing of it mattered, that a girl who could read a ledger and understand a water survey had something solid under her that couldn't be taken away just by someone deciding she was too large or too plain or too much of something they'd decided they didn't want. She was still thinking about it when Caleb found her in the barn that evening doing the end-of-day check on the horses. "Grace Caraway's girl is coming on Saturdays," she said. "I heard," he said. He leaned against the stall post with his arms crossed, watching her work. "She wants to learn the accounts." "Good. It's not a ranch operation skill exactly," she said. She wasn't sure why she was explaining it, but she kept going. "It's more knowing what things are worth, what they add up to, how to look at a situation and understand it in numbers before someone else tells you what to think about it." He was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like an important thing to know." "I think it is," she said. She checked the last horse, ran her hand down the animal's neck, stepped back. "I didn't have anyone to teach me. I had to figure it out from my father's books without him knowing I was doing it." "He didn't know?" "He thought I was putting the books away." She looked at Caleb. "He didn't think I'd be using them." He looked at her with the straightforward honesty that had been, from the beginning, the thing she trusted most about him. His loss, he said simply. She took that in, held it, let it settle in the place where those words needed to settle. Yes, she said, his loss. Her father came in June. She hadn't invited him and hadn't expected him, and when she saw Thomas Boone's wagon coming up the mountain road on a Tuesday afternoon, she stood in the yard and watched it for a full minute before she went to meet it. He looked older, thinner. The restless reaching qualities she'd grown up with had quieted into something that looked less like energy and more like a man who has been running a calculation for months and has finally arrived at an answer he doesn't like. He climbed down from the wagon and stood in front of her and looked at the ranch, at the main house, the repaired barn, the new fence sections, the kitchen garden with its early summer growth, the general organized vitality of a place that was being run well and knew it. He looked at her. "You look different," he said. "I'm the same," she said. "No." He shook his head slightly. "You don't." He turned his hat in his hands, which was apparently a thing all men of a certain age did when they were preparing to say something uncomfortable. "I heard about the winter, all of it, the fire, the storm, the water." He stopped. "The way you handled the riders at the gate." She waited. "People are telling that story," he said, "in Red Hollow, like it means something." "Maybe it does," she said. He looked at the hat in his hands. "I need to say something to you." She crossed her arms, not defensively, more as a bracing. "Say it then." "What I did at the auction." He looked up. "Trying to pull you away." "What I said after. I was—" He stopped. Tried again. "I've been thinking about how I've treated you for a long time. Not just that day." She looked at him. His face was doing something that her father's face rarely did. Something unguarded. Something that had the texture of actual difficulty, not performed difficulty. "I know I wasn't—" He stopped again. "Your mother would be—" He closed his mouth. "Don't bring Mama into this," she said quietly. "This is between you and me." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "I should have been better," he said, finally, plain. "To you. I should have been better." She stood in the mountain afternoon and looked at her father, at this tired, not particularly extraordinary man who had underestimated her so consistently and for so long that it had become a structure they both lived inside of, and she thought about what she wanted to do with this moment and what she didn't. She didn't forgive him completely. That was the honest truth. There was too much of it, and it went back too far, and some things take time that an afternoon visit in June doesn't provide. But she didn't send him away either. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He came inside. She made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table and talked, carefully, the way people talk when they're rebuilding something that was poorly built the first time, and they're both aware of it, awkwardly, with silences, with the occasional drift toward easier territory and the occasional genuine thing said despite that. Caleb came in at some point and shook Thomas Boone's hand without fanfare and found something he needed from the shelf and went back out, which was exactly the right thing to do, and which she noted with a gratitude she didn't express until later. When her father left 2 hours later, he turned at the wagon and said, "That man picked right." She looked at him. "Ryder," he said. "He picked right." He climbed up onto the wagon seat. "I didn't know it then. I should have trusted you." She stood in the yard and watched him drive back down the mountain road, and she held that small, late, imperfect acknowledgement and decided it was worth something. Not everything, but something. In the late summer, Caleb built a porch on the south side of the house. It was not a necessary thing, not a practical ranch improvement, not something that went in the supply ledger or figured in any calculation. It was just a porch, with 2 chairs facing the valley, where you could sit in the evening and watch the light change over the mountains. He built it over 3 weekends, working by himself mostly, with occasional unsolicited advice from Dutch about the post-depth that he received without visible irritation, which Abigail found impressive. The first evening they sat on it together, the mountains were going red and orange in the late sun, and the valley below them was the particular deep green of a summer that had been well watered. You could see the line of the water channel from up here, a thin, bright thread running through the valley, dividing the properties not by boundary, but by connection. You can see all of them from here, she said. Yes, he said. Henderson's place. The Aldane South pasture, the Caraway property. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the valley and all the things in it that were different from what they'd been 8 months ago when she'd ridden up this mountain road in a snowstorm with her traveling bag in her lap and the sound of Red Hollow's laughter following her. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Any of it. He turned and looked at her. Which part? The auction hall, stopping in front of me. He looked at the valley for a moment. She could see him actually considering it, not just preparing a reassuring answer, but actually thinking about it, which was one of the things she'd learned to watch for and had come to value more than she'd expected. No, he said. Just no. I regret the barn, he said. I regret what it cost, what we lost. I regret that Graves hurt the people he hurt before anyone stopped him. He looked at her. I don't regret one single decision I made about you. She turned back to the valley. I was so angry at the auction, she said, when you stopped. I was so sure it was going to be another thing to survive. Was it? No, she said. It was the thing that ended surviving and started something else. The light was going amber now, the long summer evening doing its slow work over the mountains. Somewhere down in the valley a dog was barking at something, the sound carrying up thin and clear in the still air. There's going to be another letter from the Territorial Water Authority, she said, about registering the shared system properly. We need to have someone go down to the county seat and file before October. I'll go, he said. Take the new survey maps, the ones Aldane's man drew up. They're more accurate than the original. I know, he said. He sounded almost amused. And the maintenance agreement that the 11 families signed. Driscoll suggested we register that too. Abigail. What? I know, he said again. We've talked about all of it. She looked at him. He had the almost amused expression that she'd seen more of over the months. Not the contained thing, not the careful thing, but something easier. Something that had been allowed to settle. Sorry, she said. Don't apologize. You're right about all of it. He stretched out his legs. I like that you're always thinking 3 steps ahead. Someone has to. Yes, he said. And I'm glad it's you. They sat on the porch as the light went out of the mountains, and the valley went from green to gray to the deep blue of a summer evening, and the stars came in one at a time the way they do at altitude, sharp and numerous. The dogs settled. The horses were quiet in the barn. She thought about the girl in Red Hollow who had stopped expecting anything good, who had built her whole life around the practical work of getting through days. Because getting through days was achievable, and hoping for more than that had only ever produced the specific pain of something reaching and coming back empty. She thought about what it had cost to stay open, to get into that wagon, to walk out to a gate in a blizzard, to stand in a room full of people and say the water goes to the valley and mean it. None of it had been without cost. That was the thing nobody told you and that you had to find out for yourself. That the good things cost as much as the hard things, sometimes more, because letting something matter meant accepting that you could also lose it. She had not been willing to lose it. That had turned out to matter. Caleb's hand found hers in the dark, easy and unhurried, the way it did now. Not a gesture, just a fact of where they both were. She thought about what Grace Caraway's daughter would learn on Saturday mornings, what she would carry out of this house and into her own life. How you couldn't know where a thing like that went once it started moving, through the girl, into her daughters, into the valley, into the long accumulation of small transmissions between people that eventually become, without anyone quite planning for it, the way things are. She thought about what it meant to be unforgettable, not in the way of monuments or stories told in church halls, in the quieter way, the way of someone who changed the water flow, who showed a younger woman a ledger, who stood in a doorway in February and told a man on horseback to think about what he was actually doing. The things that don't make noise but change the direction of things. She was not a simple woman. She was not a saint. She had days when the old voices came back and said the old things, and she had to consciously choose not to hand them authority over her mourning. She still got it wrong sometimes, pushed too hard, held too tight to a plan, misjudged a situation because she was moving too fast to read it properly. She was going to keep getting things wrong in the specific ways she was wired to get them wrong, and that was just the shape of it. But she had stopped. Somewhere in the mountain winter, somewhere between the 3 in the morning cattle barn and the gate in the blizzard and the kitchen table conversations that built something neither of them had a name for at the beginning, she had stopped measuring herself by the standard of people who had never wanted her to amount to anything. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the whole thing. "It's getting cold," Caleb said. "It is," she agreed. Neither of them moved. The mountains stood around them the way they had stood for 1,000 years before anyone built a ranch beneath them, or ran a water channel through the valley, or sat on a south-facing porch watching the light die. Indifferent to individual stories, patient beyond the reach of human patience, holding the cold and the dark and the occasional impossible spring without comment. But the light from the house windows reached out into the yard, and down in the valley, 14 properties were watered from a shared source that had been a rich man's weapon until a woman with rough hands and a head for numbers decided it should be something else. Small lights in a large dark. That was all any of it ever was. It was enough.